Aethelred the Unready. He was king of England from 978 until 1016. And he was married to Aethelred. With her he had 13 children, among them Edmund Ironside, or Edmund II, the same person, and also then married to Emma, the daughter of the Duke of Normandy. And with her he had 3 children, and one of them is Edmund the Confessor. His person who was before him on the throne in England was murdered, and when he became king in 978. And he was then reigning, and he has the title Aethelred the Unready. That is from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, where the person who has written that described him like that because that person really liked him. And now it goes back to that he was during the time dealing with the Danes and the Vikings, which were attacking England a lot. And he wasn't really able to stand up against them. He also fought against them. There was a Battle of Malden, 991. He tried to bribe them on the advice of the Archbishop Sigeric. He collected money, protection money, bribed the Vikings that they wouldn't attack them. He also tried it with brutality and pure violence. He ordered on the 3rd of November 1002 the St. Brice's Days massacre of all Danes. That more or less just destabilized the country, and powerful lords came about. For example, Edmund Ironside, and they were then ruling local regions. The Danes attacked. Also, the Danes attacked, and they also attacked Kent, and they burned down Canterbury Cathedral and murdered the next archbishop, the other one, Arthur Sigurd. And he had to flee then the country also. There was also battling in Ireland. The Danish king Sven Forkbeard became more or less at some parts king because he had to flee, but this was still in English hand also. When the King Sven Forkbeard died, then his son King Canute followed, 1014 then, ruling that part. Then he came also back to an ineffective end of his reign, King Aethelred the Unready. But he died then also in 1016, and he was then succeeded by his son Edmund Ironside, who was then fighting against King Canute, the son of the Danish king Sven Forkbeard. So, and then it goes on, his reign ends with that his son Edmund Ironside is fighting against the son of Sven Forkbeard, the Viking or Danish king, and they are fighting a bit, and after some severe battles they decide to share the kingdom. Edmund Ironside dies pretty soon, and King Canute starts to reign whole England then onwards after Aethelred the Unready. And that is according to the history of the kings and queens of England and Scotland, written by Edmund Swinglehurst on the page 18 and 19. Afghanic region between Hindu Kush and Helmand. Now, that region was oftentimes invaded in the past 3,000 years by different people, and it is also a region very high, on high altitudes. There are a lot of mountains. And there's, for example, the Khyber Pass, and through that people tried to invade to India in the past millennia. There's the Helmand River in the south, and then there is Gandhara and Kabul and the Hindu Kush. And now many people are farmers, and there are a lot of sheep, goats, and cattle. And what happened in the past centuries on this region, now first what is there is sometimes very warm in the summer, plus 49 degrees, and cold in the winter, minus 26, and there can be violent winds from the northeast down. Rainfall is also not so much, 10 to 40 centimeters. And now, who invaded all? It was part of the Persian Empire, 2,500 years ago. Then Alexander the Great in 331 invaded it, and it became the Hellenistic Empire of Bactria. And then in the 5th century, there were coming the Huns down from Central Asia, and then Arabs in the 8th century, and then Genghis Khan in 1220, and then Tamerlane in the 14th century. Then it was part of the Mughal Indian Empire, and the Mughal Indian Empire, it broken off under the Afghan Ahmed, and his dynasty was then fighting wars against British Empire, and the whole country then was for some time a buffer state between British India and the Russian Empire. And that is according to the Reader's Digest Library of Modern Knowledge, Book 3, Part 22, Regions of the Earth, written by Hugh Clayton, John Coyle, Michael Frenchman, and D.H. Sinclair, on the page 1093. Alexander the Great. He lived 2,300 years ago, and he conquered with his army great areas from Macedonia down over through Syria, Babylon, Persia, Egypt, up to India. Now, he was born in the year 356 before Christ in Pella, the capital of Macedonia, that is east of Greek, at the Mediterranean Sea in the eastern part, northern eastern part. His father, King Philip, had conquered Greek, and his mother was Olympus, and she had told him that he was the descendant of Achilles. Achilles is a figure, a very heroic warrior figure from the Iliad, a book written some 100 years earlier. If it is true, the story written in the Iliad, if Achilles existed or not, is not completely clear. But she was telling him that he was the descendant of his very glorious, very, very important warrior. And now, when he was 20, his father was murdered, and he became king. And he could sustain his power. He became a fixed figure. In the year 334, he went over the Bosporus, so Macedonia is where the western part of Istanbul is today, over into today's Turkey. And when he conquered, within a year he had conquered Persia, pretty much where Iran today is. He also went in 331 to Egypt, and in Egypt he became a pharaoh. Then he founded the city Alexandria, very much at the northern part at the coast. And he went there to an oasis called Ziva, and there was someone telling him that he was a descendant of Zeus. That is a mythological religious god figure. Now he went on with his army conquering more and more. In 327 he married a Bactrian princess called Roxane. Now he went on and he also conquered more to Afghanistan region today, up to Pakistan, to the Indus, up to India. When in 325 they went back. They also went to Babylon, and they were also finished off the Babylonian king, and he became also the ruler. Up to India and then back over the seaside, the Indus River down, pretty much where Pakistan is today, down, and then over the coast back to Babylon, in the southern area of today's Syria, around that region. And there are also some other things. Now, when he came back to Babylon, within a year he fell ill and died. Now, there are some other things. One thing is his type of military tactics. He was using the phalanx, so people had very long spears, some meters long, and good shields, and they were fighting together, and they could withstand cavalry attacks, so horse attacks, and they could very good fight with them. That was one key thing why he could conquer so much and so fast in just 9 years. He had a tutor called Aristotle, and at one incident there was a horse, Pacephalus, and it was said that that horse can't be tamed, can't be ridden, but he tamed it. When Gordium, that is in the center of Turkey, pretty much, there was the Gordian knot, and it was said, who can untie this knot conquers Asia. He took a sword and sliced it, according to a legend. Now, and that is according to Miles Kell's World History on the page 156 and 157. Ancient France. In the region of western France, there were the Gauls living, and they were Celtic people. And the Romans called them barbarians because they oftentimes had long hairs and beards. Now, in the year 390, these Gauls invaded Italy, and they got fought until Rome. But then they withdrew, but they stayed for 200 years in northern Italy. In 278, they made it up to Turkey, and invaded Turkey. And now, when a bit later on, when in the 50s before Christ, we're talking before Christ, there was Julius Caesar, and he led a campaign, and he conquered northern France, or northern Gaul, and that became then Roman Gaul. And there was one person, Vercingetorix, he made a last attempt to stop Caesar, but he was defeated, taken to Rome, and then 5 years later executed. Now, and when some time happened, and then in the year, during the 5th century, in 486, there was Clovis, and he was a Frank, and he invaded the Roman Gaul, and he possessed it then, he won. And then he ruled there, and the Merovingian kingdom was created, lasting until 718. And then from 718 onwards until 987, it was the Carolingian in France. Now, at one time there was when Charles II of France fighting against, in the 9th century, against Louis the German and Lothair, and in 843 there was made the Treaty of Verdun, and that basically gave Charles II of France the region which is today's France as rule. And in the year 719 there was a person, Charles Martel, and he was ruling the northern part of Gaul, of Merovingian Gaul. And soon afterwards, after he was allowed to rule the northern part, he ruled basically whole Gaul. That is according to Miles Kell's World History book on the pages 196 and 197. In the year 1745, there it happened that the Jacobites in Scotland tried again to put the James or his children onto the throne in Britain. Jacobites were the people who wanted James II or his children on the throne in Britain. And the grandson of James II was it who I wanted to have back on the throne. His name, so the name of the grandson of James II, who was supported by the Jacobites in Scotland, was Charles Edward Stuart, or also called Bonnie Prince Charlie. So Bonnie Prince Charlie had the support of the Scottish clans, and there was an uprising, and also a big battle happened, the Battle of Culloden in 1746, where the clansmen lost. Bonnie Prince Charlie fled back to Europe, and the clans were punished in a way. So the chieftains of the clans became landlords, but only if they had the favor of the British king. And the clansmen became tenants, and they had to pay for the land on which they were doing farming. And also at the time, a process known as the Highland Clearance began, the Highland Clearance. And in that, the smaller farms, known as crofts, so these crofts, small farms, were destroyed to create large areas of grazing land for large flocks of sheep and cattle. And it was also a time when many people from Scotland left Scotland to settle in North America. And that is according to the Life UK Test Handbook, page 34 and 35. In the year 1789, there was the French Revolution in France. And soon came the war between Britain and France. Napoleon became the Emperor of France, and the war continued. In the year 1805, there was the Battle of Trafalgar, and in that battle, the British Navy defeated the French and Spanish combined army. In that battle, the Battle of Trafalgar, 1805, Admiral Nelson led the British Navy, and he died in that battle. And at Trafalgar Square in London, there's a column for him as a monument. And his ship, the HMS Victory, can be seen in Portsmouth. In the year 1805, there was the Battle of Waterloo, and that ended the Napoleonic Wars. And in that Battle of Waterloo, the commander of the British troops was Wellington, also called the Iron Duke, and Wellington also then became Prime Minister at one time. And that is according to the Life in UK Test Handbook, page 38 and 39. In the 1760s, there were substantial British colonies in North America. And the people who were there had settled there because they believed in religious freedom, which they got there. And they had also interest in ideas of liberty. Now, the British government wanted to tax the British colonies, but they said no taxation without representation in the British Parliament. And so fighting broke out, and eventually in the year 1776, 13 of these colonies declared their independence. And the war happened, but these 13 colonies won the war, and in the year 1783 they were recognized by Britain as independent. And that is according to the Life in UK Test Handbook, page 38. On the 28th June 1914, Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria, was killed in an assassination. And that sparked the outbreak of the First World War from 1914 until 1918. In the leading up years, Britain was a superpower, and the people had a mood of optimism. Many changes were to improve his social life and so on were done. Throughout whole Europe there was a growing sense of militarism and of imperialism, and two parties started to be formed, the Allied and the Central Powers. The Allied were, for example, Britain, France, Italy, the United States, and the Central Powers, mainly Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire and Ottoman Empire. Then, after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria, on the 28th June 1914, the First World War broke out. In this First World War, 2 million British casualties were recorded, and, for example, there were 60,000 casualties just on the first attack in July 1916 by the Battle of the Somme. It was a worldwide war. For example, also 1 million people from India fought on behalf of the British, and 40,000 Indian people died. On the 11th November 1918, the First World War ended, and every year in Britain there is the Remembrance Day on the 11th November, and at 11 o'clock on the 11th November in Britain there's a 2-minute silence, and wreaths are laid down in commemoration of fallen soldiers at the cenotaph in Whitehall in London. And that is according to the Life in the UK Test Handbook on the pages 46 and 47. Cape Canaveral, that is on the east side of Florida, in the United States, and Florida on the east side. And it is the main launching rocket site for the rockets of the United States of America, for the NASA. And from 1963 until 1973, it was called Cape Kennedy. And now since 1950, where it's doing the US military, the US Air Force test firing of military missiles. And then the NASA also used it to make things. 1958, the first satellite was launched from there into space. And the Saturn rockets for the Apollo and Skylab program were there assembled and launched from there then. And also the space shuttle are intended to be used there on that place. And that is all according to the Reader's Digest Library of Modern Knowledge, Book 1, Part 1, Structure of the Universe, written by Ian Ridworth and Jonas Shakespeare. The whole book written in the 1970s, on the page 50.
Charles de Gaulle led French forces against Nazi Germany during World War II. In 1985, he became the Prime Minister. He rewrote the Constitution of France and founded the Fifth Republic. And from 1959 to 1969, he was the President of France.
Charles I believed, like his father, James I, in the divine right of kings. And that means that he believed that he, as the king, has the God-given right to rule. And now for 11 years he ruled without approval of the parliament, if the parliament wasn't him giving him the approval. So and then he tried to impose on the Scottish Presbyterian Church a book of prayer. And that wasn't really received, and there was an armed rebellion. And now the king really needed money. So Charles I needed really money, and he asked the parliament. But in the parliament there were the Puritans, and they didn't like the religious views and the reforms which Charles I was doing with the Church of England, and they weren't giving him the money to raise an army against this Scottish army. And even after the Scottish army had invaded England, they weren't giving him the money. Now, then the king also at one time Charles I entered the House of Commons to arrest 5 members, but they were warned and they weren't aware. Now and then in 1642, civil war broke out between the king, supported by the Cavaliers, and the Parliament, supported by the Roundheads. There were the battles of Marston Moor and Nesby, in which the king's army was defeated, and then Charles I was taken prisoner, and he was still in over years not ready to agree or to come to an agreement with the Parliament, and now he was then executed in 1649. Then there was a bit unclear who rules England, but one general of the army of the Parliament was Oliver Cromwell, and Oliver Cromwell became the Lord Protector and ruled England. And that is according to the Life in the UK Test Handbook, page 27, 28 and 29. Cleopatra. She was the Queen of Egypt. There's a Mediterranean Sea between Europe and Africa, and there's Egypt in the northern part of Africa. And she was there 2,000 years ago, the Queen of Egypt. In the year 51 before Christ, she became the Queen of Egypt. Now, she was the last descendant on the throne of Egypt of the Macedonians, of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, he had a general called Ptolemy, and she was the descendant of him. After Alexander the Great has died, Ptolemy became the ruler. Now, she became at the same time queen as also her brother became king, but he drove her out. His name was also Ptolemy, her brother's name. He drove her out and he seized with power. But then Julius Caesar helped her to come back onto the throne in Egypt. Now, and she was with Julius Caesar as a couple, and they had a son called Caesarion. She moved to Rome with Caesarion and lived there where also Julius Caesar was living. So Rome is in the northern part of Europe. Is Egypt, and 600-700 kilometers north is now Italy. And we were living there, but then in the year 44 before Christ, so she was at that point for 7 years queen of Egypt, where Caesar was murdered. And there broke a civil war out, and she went probably back to Egypt. And there was now another person, Mark Antony. Mark Antony had 3 children now with Cleopatra. And he was, for political reasons, married to Octavia, who was the sister of the Roman emperor, then Octavia. And then later, when Octavian was the actual empire, then he had the name Augustus Caesar. And now, they tried to get power, Mark Antony and Cleopatra. They tried to rule the Eastern Roman Empire. And they didn't, because in the Battle of Actium in the year 31 before Christ, their armies were defeated off the coast of Greek. That is now, there's Egypt, there's Italy, and there's Greek. And they both fled then to Egypt, and Cleopatra spread the rumors that she was dead, probably to flee. And Mark Antony was in despair about it, tells the story, and so he committed suicide. He died, according to the story, in her arms. Now, Cleopatra tried to make peace with Octavian. Augustus won the ruler of the Roman Empire, but it didn't work out, and so she laid an asp, according to the story, an asp, which is a poisonous snake, onto her breast, and then died of its poison of the snake. Octavian wrote about her, and he described her as a wicked temptress, and that description stuck then in many people's mind, but he was an enemy of her. And also, now there's a legend told that at one time she was delivering herself rolled up in a carpet to Julius Caesar. But it's not clear if it actually happened. Now, whatever the truth. Now, the people in Egypt thought of her as a great and good queen. That is according to world history on the page 162 and 163. Of Winston Churchill, there are some lines still quoted today. Winston Churchill was a member of Parliament in the United Kingdom and during the Second World War Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. For example, in 1940, when he just got to be Prime Minister, he said to the House of Commons in one of his speeches, one line, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears and sweat." After the evacuation of trapped soldiers in Dunkirk, 300,000 were saved, he said to the House of Commons also in the year 1940, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." And after the Battle of Britain, where the Royal Air Force had defended against the attacking German planes, he said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." And that is according to the Life in the UK Test Handbook, page 50. Florence Nightingale was born in 1820. From 1851 until 1854 she trained as a nurse in Germany. Then in 1854 she went to Turkey, because there she treated soldiers who were fighting in the Crimean War. The Crimean War was from 1853 until 1856 and fought between Britain, Turkey and France against Russia. Now, during this Crimean War, where she treated patients and wounded soldiers, she improved the conditions of hospitals. And that was necessary because during the Crimean War, most soldiers rather died from illnesses which were caught, or infections which were caught in hospitals, than from the battle bonds. The Crimean War was also the first war to be covered extensively by news stories and photographs, and also the Victoria Cross for soldiers who showed valor was started to be given out. Then in 1860, after the Crimean War, she opened in London in the St. Thomas Hospital the Nightingale Training School for Nurses. And it was the first of its kind. The nurses were trained how to do nursing, and she is seen by many people as the founder of modern nursing. And that is according to the Life in the UK Test Handbook, page 42 and 43. Gassire's Lute. It is around 2,000-year-old epic poem out of the Dorsey, an album of other songs. There is a person called Gassire, and he's a Father prince. The father lived 2,500 years ago in Central East Africa between the Sahara and the Nile. It's about that person, Gassire, and he has a lute that is a guitar-like instrument. So it's about Gassire's lute. And he is a prince, and he's waiting to become the next king. He realizes that he can only be remembered through fame when it is sung about him in battle songs. So when he makes it more or less happen, that a war starts with another group in which 7 of his sons die and also many other people. And now it is so with his lute that the lute is not singing properly, hasn't a proper sound. But now where he is also in grief about the loss of his 7 sons and all the suffering which his actions of wanting to have war so that he can be remembered is now big there. Now his lute plays. So now where he is full of grief and suffering also, now his lute plays, and he is at the same time at grief about the loss and enjoy that the lute is playing and that he will be remembered in battle songs. That is according to Miles Kell's World History book on the page 202 and 203. Geiger Counter. They are named after Hans Geiger, who had perfected them. Now it is a little thing and then a little tube, basically. A little box, oftentimes, and then a little tube. Inside of the tube, there's gas. The outside of the tube of that cylinder, that is a cathode, so a material which is conducting electricity. And inside of the cylinder, there's protruding a wire. That is the anode. Now, and there is hypothetically the chance that from this anode or from this cathode, one to the other one, is electricity flowing or current flowing. And if there's current flowing between the anode standing just peacefully in the middle and the cylinder at the outside, then the Geiger counter says there's electricity flowing. It starts to click or show something with a needle or something that there is electricity flowing. That electricity is now the goal to make it going by a Geiger counter. Inside of a cylinder, there is gas at low pressure. There's gas inside of it. And then, if no radiation hits it, that thing, so the people have it in their hand, and if no, there's an area with a lot of radiation, the radiation hits the gas inside of a cylinder. And when the gas hits these atoms inside of the cylinder, the gas consists out of atoms. These atoms are hit, and now they're splitting. It becomes an ion. An ion is just an atom which has lost or gained an electron, and the electron which was lost. So the atom is splitting, it loses an electron, and it becomes the ion, and there's the electron. Now we don't have in our cylinder with our anode standing and the cathode at the outside just the gas. Now we're having ions and electrons. And suddenly, through these electrons, their electricity can run. And now the Geiger counter says there's electricity running from the anode over the electrons to the cathode, or the other way around. And the Geiger counter says there's radioactivity. So there's a cylinder, outside cathode, inside anode, radioactivity hits the gas in the inside, splits this atom's gas into ions and electrons. Now suddenly all full of electrons, the current can run from anode to cathode and cathode to anode, and from one to the other. And the Geiger counter says current is flowing, there's radioactivity, give an alarm, give a sound, whatever. That is according to Science Encyclopedia by Susan McKeever on the page 27. But this is no substitute for medical knowledge.
Guilty of a wrongdoing is someone who did it. Someone commits a crime, thereby becoming guilty of that crime. Guile is a clever, tricky, but oftentimes dishonest way of doing something. The story of the Trojan horse is one of a guile. The Trojans were besieged, the beleaguering enemy vanished, but left a giant wooden horse. The Trojans, believing that the enemy had given up, and the wood horse their gesture of respect, brought it inside the city. Some soldiers of the enemy had hidden in the wood horse, later on got out, and opened the city gates to the reappearing hostiles. The Trojans were outwitted by a guile of the enemy.
In the year 1685, Charles II, who was the king, died, and he had no legitimate children. So his brother, James II, opened the throne. Charles II was a Protestant, James II a Catholic, and he had two eldest daughters who were Protestant. So James II, a Catholic, was ruling a bit Catholic-like. He favored Catholics and he let bishops of a Protestantistic Church of England arrest, and he allowed Catholic people to become army officers. The people accepted that because they thought after him one of his two daughters, the oldest one Mary, would become queen, and his daughters were Protestantistic. So they thought just for intermediate time there would be a Catholic king with James II. But the wife of James II got a son, and now it wasn't clear anymore if the next king might be at the end a Catholic, and the whole country got be recatholicized. And so the Glorious Revolution happened, and in 1688 they invited William of Orange to invade England. William of Orange was the king of the Netherlands. And he could just invade without any fighting because the eldest daughter, Mary, who was a Protestant, did let him in, and they two were married. So the eldest daughter, a Protestantic, of James II was married to William of Orange. The people invited William of Orange in, and they then started to rule together without any fighting. So William of Orange ruled together, the king of the Netherlands, with Mary, the eldest daughter of James II, also Protestantistic. James II fled to Europe. And that's according to the Life in the UK Test Handbook, page 30. In the year 1603, Queen Elizabeth I died, and she had no children. So her heir became James VI of Scotland. There wasn't before a James on the throne in England, so he was simultaneously James VI of Scotland and James I of England. Both countries remained separate countries. During the time of James I, James VI, reign, so it's the same person, James VI, James I, there was the King James Bible introduced, and that Bible, it wasn't the first one, but it is written in English, is still used by many Protestant churches today. Now there was a lot of rebellion in Ireland against the Protestant rule of Queen Elizabeth I and also of James I. And the government in London encouraged people to settle in the northern part of Ireland in Ulster, and these settlements were called plantations, and also companies based in London had given land from Ireland. And James I continued this policy, and also in other areas of Ireland land was given. James I, as well as his son, Charles I, believed in the divine rights of kings. That means that they believed that they had a God-given right to rule, and that led to disagreements with the parliament. By Charles I then, that led to the civil wars. And that is according to the Life in the UK Test Handbook, page 27 and 28. Julius Ceasar. When he was 17, he defied Sulla, and he married Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna. When he was 30, she already died. Now, when it was the year 60, he lived from 100 to 44 before Christ. When it was the year 60 before Christ, he founded the Triumvirate together with Crassus and Pompey, and named a group of three. Now, and the three were basically ruling Rome. Now, in 58 and onwards, when he started to conquer the northern part of France and also the southern part of Britain, and that gave him a lot of fame and power. And Pompey, one of the three people, a part of Crassus, of a Triumvirate, then started from 53 until 48, for 5 years, 53, 48, to have a war with him. That ended when in Egypt, Caesar won, and then Egypt, he fell in love with Cleopatra, the ruling pharaoh of Egypt. And then then on, he was basically the ruling emperor. He became also the ruling emperor. Now, and then it happened that on 15th March 44, because many people of the Senate who wasn't so sure if his way of ruling was good for Rome, decided to kill him, and then a group led by Brutus and Cassius, not Crassus, Cassius, stabbed him to death. Now, he was a famous general. He led military campaigns. He was a general, a leader also of Rome now, a famous one. He wrote books, for example, the Gallum Bellum, about how his campaigns was fought, the wars in northern France and in Britain, in southern Britain. He was a speech person. He could hold speeches and excite crowds, and he was also a politician with many ambitious ideas, and many of them were never brought to be acting out because he was assassinated. Many ideas about how ending corruption, reforms, and so on. That is according to Miles Kelly's World History book on the page 190 and 191. King Canute. He was the King of England from 1016 until 1035, and from 1019 then also the King of Denmark, and 1028 onwards also the King of Norway. His father was the King Sven Forkbeard, a Viking king. His mother Gunhild. And his predecessor in England was Aethelred II. He then died, and then King Canute was having severe battles with the son of Aethelred II, Edmund Ironside, for who becomes the king on the throne. So Aethelred II dies, he has a son who was already fighting against him. King Canute had invaded in 1015 England, and his son, Edmund Ironside, son of Aethelred II, was fighting against King Canute. The people wasn't really seeing the support of Aethelred the Unready to his son, Edmund Ironside, against the invading Vikings under King Canute. They saw him as a bit as a rebel, Edmund Ironside. And Aethelred the Unready, by the way, has the byname the Unready because he wasn't really decisive on how to deal with the Danes. He tried to pay the money that they weren't doing attacks and so on. He also attacked them, ordered massacres, was getting the money, so he wasn't really good how to prepare them. Now then, in 1015, King Canute invades. His son Edmund Ironside fights against him. 1016, Aethelred the Unready dies. Edmund Ironside and King Canute fighting for who is leading now England. They're having severe battles. In the Battle of Allington in Essex, where then King Canute defeats Edmund Ironside, they meet at the Isle of Ailnay in the River Seine on River Severn in the middle on an island, and they agree on sharing the kingdom. Edmund Ironside is murdered, and Canute becomes the whole ruler of England. And he rules, and he encourages Christianity, and he appoints Saxon and Danish people to become priests. And he is treating Danes and Saxons equally. And he marries Elgiva. With her he has Harold Hereford as a son. And he marries Emma. With her he has Halfdanut as a son. Both wives, if I understand it correctly, were married to Aethelred the Unready. Now, and these two sons, when after King Canute had died, battling who becomes the king. They then die in 1040 and 1042. And now it goes then a bit on, and it becomes then the next person becomes Edward the Confessor, becomes the next king. Edward the Confessor is also a son of Aethelred II, if I'm correctly. And now Edward the Confessor then at one time is then in exile in the Normandy, and where he promises in return for the helping of the Duke of Normandy, him to be the next king of England. We're talking about William the Conqueror. Then Edward the Confessor goes back to England, and he changes his mind, and he decides to give now Harold of Wessex the kingdom. King Canute had split up the country into 4 earldoms, into Wessex and Northumbria and Mercia and East Anglia. What happens now? Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror, is not so happy that he is not getting what was him promised, the kingdom of England, after Edward the Confessor had died, the son of Aethelred the Unready. And he invades England, defeats them in the Battle of Hastings in 1066, Harold the Saxon king. Now, and somewhere in between is the story of King Canute. And that is according to the history of the kings and queens of England and Scotland, written by Edmund Swinglehurst on the pages 22 and 23.
Let foe come on foe, as wave comes on wave, we'll give them a welcome, we'll give them a grave. Out of The Thistle of Scotland by Sutherland.
Like soldiers, so in battle we succeed, on peril scaping, by another bleed. Out of On Mirrors Singing by George Granville.
Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher was a chemist and a lawyer. And in 1959 she became a member of parliament for the Conservatives. In 1970 she became then the Secretary of State for Education and Science. And then in 1975 she became the leader of a Conservative Party
and now from then on she was leading the opposition. Then in the general election in 1979, her party, the Conservatives, won the general election, and now she became the first prime minister who was a woman. And so she was now from 1979 until 1990, for 11 years, the longest time which someone was prime minister in the 20th century in Britain, prime minister. So Margaret Thatcher was prime minister from 1979 until 1990. She worked closely together with Ronald Reagan, the US-American president at the time, and she welcomed and recognized the changes in the Soviet Union, which then led to the end of the Cold War. There were things done in the economy while she was prime minister. For example, the nationalized industries to privatized, and the trade unions were in the power restricted, and there happened deregulation, and that helped to make the City of London a center for investment and financial services. In 1982, so while she was prime minister, Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, and a naval task force was formed to recover and reconquer the islands. And that is according to the Life in the UK Test Handbook on the pages 58 and 59. In the 1640s, there was civil war in England between the King's Army, supported by the Cavaliers, and the Parliamentary Army, supported by the Roundheads. In the Battle of Marston Moor and Nesby, the King's Army was defeated, and the King was taken prisoner and then executed in 1649. One of the generals of the Parliamentary Army was Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell also was sent to Ireland where rebellion was, and he there smashed the rebellion down, and that did he do with so much violence that he's still a controversial figure in Ireland. Now, I said that Charles I was executed in 1649, and many people in Scotland didn't like that, and they rather wanted now Charles II, a son of Charles I, the one who was executed, on the throne, instead of Oliver Cromwell ruling. And now Oliver Cromwell also defeated the Scottish army, and now Oliver Cromwell was seen as the leader of England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland. And he then had the title Lord Protector. He ruled for quite some years, and when his son Richard Cromwell followed on the throne, people didn't like how he was ruling so much, and so they invited Charles II in. Charles II, the one who was supported by the Scottish people, on the throne, and who was defeated in the battles of Worcester and Dunbar. So after Oliver Cromwell died, his son Richard Cromwell followed onto the throne. The people rather wanted when Charles II onto the throne. They had invited him in. Charles II was the one who was defeated by Oliver Cromwell in the battles of Worcester and Dunbar. And that is according to the Life in UK Test Handbook, page 28, 29 and 30.
Remembrance Day is in the United Kingdom on the 11th November. And on this 11th November, the people who had died fighting for the United Kingdom and its allies are commemorated. Originally it was for the people who died fighting for the United Kingdom in the First World War. The First World War ended on the 11th November 1918. And so at 11 o'clock at the 11th November, there is 2 minutes silence in the United Kingdom. And some people are wearing red poppies, so red flowers, because they grew in the fields where a lot of battling of the First World War happened. And also then on the 11th November at 11 o'clock, there are wreaths laid down at the Cenotaph in Whitehall in London. The United Kingdom had 2 million casualties in the First World War. And that is according to the Life in the UK Test Handbook, page 72. Souls are by love, not words combined. The End of Two Colors by Charles Sedley.
The Battle of Blenheim was on the 13th of August 1704. It was fought in Blenheim, which is in Germany. And there were 52,000 British and Austrian forces of Marlborough, of the Duke of Marlborough, John Churchill, and the Austrian forces of Eugene of Savoy, together fighting against the French, which was the whole country ruled in by Louis XIV and commanded now by Marshal Tallard, and these fought against. So 60,000 French and Bavarian troops against the British 52,000 and Austrian 52,000 in Blenheim. and they won. The British and Austrian forces won. Marshal Talent was captured, and half of his army of 60,000 people died, was wounded or captured. And that all happened through the Wars of Succession that all happened during the Spanish Wars of Succession during the time, and it also put a big stop or a big pause or a big little thing against Louis XIV's ambitions to dominate Europe of the French king. So, 30th August 1704, Battle of Blenheim in Germany. The Bavarian and French troop, 60,000 lost against the British of the Duke of Marlborough, John Churchill, and the Eugene of Savoy, Austrian troops. That is according to part 2, page 598 of the Reader's Digest Library of Modern Knowledge book by T.F.C. Black, Harold Blackmore, Neil Grant, Robert Lacey, John O'Brien, Renner, Jonathan Sump, Julie Winch, and Asmund Reddy. In 1939, Nazi Germany had started to attack its neighboring countries, and in the summer of 1940 there was the Battle of Britain. The Royal Air Force of the United Kingdom was defending the United Kingdom against the attacking German planes. The Royal Air Force had, for example, the planes Spitfire and Hurricane. Britain won the Battle of Britain, but Germany continued in the following years to bomb in something called the Blitz areas of Britain, for example, the East End of London and Coventry. But despite this large amount of destruction following the Blitz and following years after the Battle of Britain, Britain pulled together, and there's also the phrase then arisen, the Blitz spirit, which is used to describe when Britons are pulling together. Nazi Germany was then defeated in the following years by all the surrounding countries, by the Allied forces, the Soviet Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, and completely defeated. And that is mostly according to the Life in UK Test Handbook, page 49. The Battle of Hastings. Probably was it Odo, the Bishop of Bayeux, who had ordered to make an embroidered tapestry with wool embroidered onto linen about the channel crossing of William I or William the Conqueror, William the Duke of Normandy, with his troops over the channel to Britain, and in the Battle of Hastings. And now it happened like that. On the 28th September, when William the Conqueror crossed the channel with many people, he had when at the battle 300 mounted soldiers and 2,000 foot soldiers and archers. There was previously that Edward the Confessor was in exile by him in the Normandy, and in return for that favor, he promised then William the Duke of Normandy the throne of England. But then when Edward the Confessor got back to England, he redecided, and he wanted to give now Harold of Wessex the throne. William the Conqueror wasn't happy with that, and so he invaded then on the 28th September. Harold of Wessex was in the north at Stamford Bridge fighting a successful battle against Harold Hardrada, who was a Viking and his force, and he hurried down to encounter William the Conqueror. And when William the Conqueror had already a bit advanced, and when the battle was happening on the 14th October 1066, and he was on a ridge, Harold of Wessex, and when the Normans were taking with a cavalry charge, they were repelling it, they were pursuing it down, and then they landed in the middle of lots of soldiers with axes and so on, and it wasn't well working, and they were retreating. When archers were firing at them, an arrow hit Van Harold of Wessex in the eye, and the troops were leaderless, they started to flee, and there was the battle. William the Conqueror won. And she was never married to him, Edith of a Swan Neck, but she had 5 children with him, and she and also his mother, Gutha of Harold of Wessex, was watching from the watch oak from an oak tree the battle. And she, so the mother Gutha, lost 3 sons and a nephew in the battle, and Edith of a Swan Neck was only able to recognize Van Harold of Wessex through after she had taken away the chainmails, or the armor, the chainmail away on the body tattoos that it was Harold of Wessex. A Battle Abbey was then on the order of William the Conqueror built from there, and William the Conqueror refused to give Harold of Wessex a proper burial. He had just gotten a royal cloth and was buried then in stones in the cliffs of Hastings. Later he was reburied at Waltham Abbey, then with a bigger tomb. And William the Conqueror became King of England. There was another assembling again of troops against him, of the other Saxon nobles who didn't want him, but he defeated them and he crowned himself then in Westminster Abbey in 1066 on the 25th December, the Christmas day, the king. And that is according to the history of the kings and queens of England and Scotland, written by Edmund Swinglehurst on the pages 26 and 27. The Byzantine Empire. There was the big Roman Empire, and when 476 the western part had fallen and only the Eastern Roman Empire lived on, and the capital of it became then Constantinople, which is the modern-day Istanbul. And in the following years, when many architects and artists worked and built a lot of buildings and built the city out. There was, for example, built the Hippodrome then at one time, or when under Justinian, who later built also hundreds of churches everywhere, the Hagia Sophia. The Hippodrome, it was like the Circus Maximus when in Rome, a big place where horses could run with chariots or quadrilles. Around 60,000 spectators could watch it. And it was in a more tranquil and calmer area in the center of Constantinople. Around it was more noisy for 1 million people living there. Justinian, that was an emperor there, and he had a general called Belisarius, and Belisarius then conquered Italy, and Justinian, while he was the emperor, was able that his army conquered all the region around the Mediterranean Sea again, like the Roman Empire. He was married to Theodora, and she helped him and advised him, and she helped him to have not laws which would be disadvantage to poor people or to women. And there was a lot of intrigues going on. 29 of the 88, so every third, emperor was killed in intrigues of the Byzantine Empire. In 1204 there came the Crusaders, Christian Crusaders down, and they completely ransacked the city and stole all the goods. And the whole city declined. 95% less population was living there then, in 200 years later. And then in 1453, Mehmed II then conquered it. It was for a long time not conquered, so for almost 1,000 years, because they had a secret weapon, the Greek fire, in 650 invented, and it is something out of lime and sulfur, and if water is added to it, there's a chemical reaction, the fire gets greater. And it was lying on a trading route between Asia and Europe, and people were then there trading things back and forth, silk and gold, gems, and stuff like that. And Constantinople was taking tariffs on that. He said 10%. And Justinian was also described by Procopius, his secretary, as the demon incarnate. And that is according to Miles Keller's World History book on the pages 222 and 223. In 1939, Nazi Germany had started to attack its neighbors. Then in June 1941, Germany attacked the Soviet Union. And in the Soviet Union, Germany had great losses. Also in December 1941, did Japan attack the United States in Pearl Harbor. And now Germany was, from 1941 onwards, fighting the Soviet Union and the United States. And the Allied forces, the Soviet Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Australia, New Zealand, started now to get the upper hand. Germany had great losses in the Soviet Union, and the Allied forces with the Americans were not strong enough to get the upper hand. On the 6th June 1944, the Allied forces landed in the Normandy in France and started to liberate France. They had also previously started to conquer Italy and also in northern part of Africa, where Germany had also done war. They had done victories. Slowly over the course of a year, from the 6th June 1944, when the D-Day was, to the 8th May 1945, Germany was defeated completely and Germany surrendered. Scientists led by Ernest Rutherford in Manchester and Cambridge University made it possible to split the atom, and that was an important step to develop the atom bomb, then done in the Manhattan Project. And that was done in the United States of America. And the United States of America then dropped on Japan 2 of these atom bombs, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And these supermassive bombs, which kills 10,000s of people immediately and 10,000s multiple 10,000s more in the aftermath, made it clear for the Empire of Japan to surrender. And so in August 45, Japan surrendered. In May 45, Germany was defeated through the Allied forces. In August 45, through the drop of these 2 atom bombs, Japan surrendered. So the Second World War ended in Europe with the surrendering of Germany on the 8th of May 1945 and in August 45 in the Pacific. And that is according to the Life in UK Test Handbook, page 51. In 1940, during the Second World War, Nazi Germany was advancing fast through France, and the British and French troops who were defending France retreated and were then trapped at the western coast of France near Dunkirk. And now the Navy was trying to save these people, but also many people with small pleasure boats and fishing boats sailed from Britain out to Dunkirk over and evacuated the soldiers there. 300,000 soldiers were saved that way. And the phrase, the Dunkirk spirit, is respect. And that is according to the Life in UK Test Handbook, page 49. In the year 1685, Britain was ruled successively for a long time by Protestantistic monarchs. For example, Elizabeth I, James VI, Charles I, Charles II. Now in the year 1685, Charles II died, and he had no legitimate children. So they were all Protestantistic, the previous monarchs. Charles II was Protestantistic, but now his brother got onto the throne because Charles II had no legitimate children. And his brother, James II, was a Catholic. So after all this time and these different monarchs of Protestants on the throne, there was suddenly a Catholic king on the throne. The people thought the next monarch will be a Protestant because the 2 children, the oldest one Mary, of James II were Protestantistic. So James II, the Catholic king now, in 1685, had 2 children, Mary, one of them, and they both were Protestants. Mary was married to William of Orange, the ruler of the Netherlands, who was also Protestant. So James II had an oldest daughter, Mary, a Protestant, who was married to a Protestant, the ruler of the Netherlands. Suddenly, the wife of James II got a son. And now the people thought, what if that son comes onto the throne? That might be a Catholic. And so they decided to invite in William of Orange, the ruler of the Netherlands, to invade Britain. And that happened without any resistance. That is the Glorious Revolution. No fighting happened in England. William of Orange, the Protestantistic ruler of the Netherlands, invaded without any fighting England, and he then started together the ruling with his wife Mary, the oldest Protestantistic daughter of James II. James II fled to Europe. James II wanted the throne back. So he invaded with help of the French army Ireland. But in the Battle of Boyne, they were defeated. And he fled back to France. In Scotland there was also an uprising, but that was in the Battle of Killiecrankie, also defeated. And the Scottish clans, they wanted also James II on the throne. They had to make an oath onto William on the throne. And there were, for example, the MacDonalds of Glenorchy. They didn't want to take the oath and they were massacred. And the remembrance of this massacre means that there are still for quite some time people wanting James back onto the throne. And they were called the Jacobites. And actually, a century later, there was the grandson of James II, his name Charles Edward Stuart, or Bonnie Prince Charlie. And there was now an uprising in Scotland again to get this Bonnie Prince Charlie, the grandson of James II, onto the throne. But that was in the Battle of Culloden defeated, this uprising, and the clans were dissolved, basically. So the chieftains of the clans became landlords, and the clansmen became tenants, and they had to pay to have the land. And also the Highland clearance started, and many of these crofts, these smaller farms, were bundled together to make grazing areas, to make space for large flocks of sheep and cattle. And that is all according to the Life in the UK Test Handbook, multiple pages, for example, 30 and 31. the Han Empire. Liu Bang was a poor villager, but when the Qin Empire broke down and he became to be the king of a small Han kingdom in 210 before Christ. And then in 206 before Christ, he led an army into Qin, and there they burned down the capital Qiangyang and also looted the tomb of Shi Huangji, and also burned down the library in which many books existed just one time. And this Han Empire, which was then basically founded with Liu Bang, who counted himself then to be the first Han Emperor in the year 210 before Christ, and took the name Huazu, and existed for around 400 years. When 200 after Christ, it broke slowly down through internal intrigues and through rebellious groups like the Yellow Turbans. Now, while it existed, there was trading done. For example, through the Silk Route over Damascus, also to the Roman Empire. Both empires had around the same size. And there were many craftspeople working in the Han Empire in beautiful and crowded cities, and they were doing stuff out of wood and paint and silk, and they were trading over the Silk Route, silk for example, or also horses and China. And in the year 165 before Christ, it became a duty for people who held public office to become scholars and make exams. And it was during the time tried to revive the teachings of Confucius, a philosopher who lived earlier. And the whole empire reached its peak under Wuji around 100 before Christ. That is according to Miles Kell's World History on page 56 and 57. During the interwar period, so from 1918, the end of the First World War, to 1939, the begin of the Second World War, in Britain the living conditions improved. Many new houses were built, for example. Then in the year 1929, the world entered the Great Depression, and many areas of Britain were badly affected by it. Mass unemployment happened in many areas of Britain. Some industries were harder affected than other ones. For example, the shipping industry was strongly and badly affected. Other ones, like the aviation, so plane building, or the automobile industry, they grew. During the 1930s, the car ownership number rose from 1 million to 2 million. So the number of people who had a car in Britain doubled in the 1930s. There were people like Graham Greene and Evelyn Vaughan who wrote books. Graham Greene, he wrote, for example, The Heart of the Matter, Brighton Rock, The Honorary Council, or Evelyn Vaughan, who wrote Decline and Fall, Scoop, and Brightside Revisited. And there was then also John Maynard Keynes. He made influential new theories to the economy. The BBC started to firstly broadcast radio in 1922, and in 1936 the BBC started to regularly broadcast a television series. And that is according to the Life in UK Test Handbook, page 48. The Mali Empire, it was the most powerful state in the 13th and 14th century in Africa. And by 1235, the people, the Mandingos, called in this book here, had conquered Ghana and then also the smaller kingdoms of Niger. And now by 1400, they had conquered 1,600 kilometers land inwards, and they were controlling now, their king was Wanza Musa, his name, they were controlling the trade in the Sahara and to Sudan. And the empire slowly declined then, and then finally in 1588 through the attacks of the Moroccan Tuaregs. And that is according to History of Mankind on the page 615 of the Reader's Digest Library of Modern Knowledge, Book 2, Chapter 11, written by T.F.C. Black, Harold Blackman, Neil Grant, Robert Lacey, John O'Byrne, Jonathan Sumption, Julie Winch, Esmond Wright, and Esmond Wright. The mood in Britain at the beginning of the 20th century. Britain was the largest empire the world had ever seen, with over 400 million people as a population. Some people thought the empire was overexpanded and conflicts in Africa and the northwest frontier of India were drained on resources. Other people thought the empire should expand further to increase commerce and trade. From 1899 until 1902, there was the Boer War in Africa, in South Africa, and where the British soldiers fought against Dutch settlers, the Boer. Many people in Britain publicly sympathized with the Boer. The war caused many people to die, and also from diseases, not just from the battle itself. And then, in fact, over the course of the 20th century, many countries of the British Empire went mostly peacefully over to Commonwealth countries and gained their independence. The area of the beginning of the 20th century was all over an area of optimism. Britain was a thriving nation. It had a great expanded empire, a well-admired navy, and also in social things were done. There was better support for divorced mothers if they were divorced or separated from the husband, and also free meals and schools were introduced, financial help for workers who were unemployed, and also pensions for older people. And salaries were given out now to members of parliament, so people could now actively start to take a part in the politician's life, because they get no money there. It all ended very abruptly with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria, on the 28th June 1914, sparkling the First World War. And that is according to the Life in the UK Test Handbook, page 45 and 46. There was William, the Duke of Normandy, and in the year 1066 he invaded Britain. In the Battle of Hastings he defeated Harold, who was the Saxon king, the important king of England. Harold died in the battle, and William, the Duke of Normandy, became William the Conqueror. Scotland and Wales were not conquered. The Battle of Hastings is depicted in the Bordeaux Tapestry, which is a 70-meter long embroidery about the battle, and which can be still seen today. The Norman Conquest brought changes in the government and in the social structures. For example, the system of feudalism, which is a system of agriculture, where the king is lending money to the lords, and therefore the lord has to send the peasants and serfs living on the land to the war efforts of the king. And also, the ruling class through the Norman Conquest was speaking Norman French, and that had an influence on the development of the modern English language. And William the Conqueror sent people out in all parts of the kingdom to list what towns and villages are there and what people lived and what animals they had. And that is written down in the Domesday Book, and that gives an insight into the social structures shortly after the time of the Norman Conquest in 1066, according to the Life in the UK Test Handbook on the pages 15 and 16.
In the 19th century, there was a growing sense of nationalism in Ireland. There were people like the Fenians who wanted complete independence from the United Kingdom, and other people like Charles Stuart Parnell who wanted Home Rule. Home Rule would mean that Ireland stays a part of the United Kingdom, but that it has its own parliament and can govern itself. Then in the year 1913, there was a Home Rule bill introduced, but Protestants from Northern Ireland rejected it, and they also threatened to use force against it. Then the First World War broke out in 1914, and the British Parliament decided to postpone decisions on Ireland. During the First World War, when in the year 1916 there was the Easter Rising in Ireland, in Dublin, against the British. The uprising was defeated, and the leader of the Easter Uprising were executed. Then a guerrilla war started. In the year 1921, a peace treaty was signed, and in 1922, Ireland became two separate countries. The 6 mostly Protestant counties of the north became Northern Ireland, and the rest of Ireland became the Irish Free State, which then in the year 1949 became the Republic of Ireland. The trouble were then in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s, and that was fighting between people who wanted complete Irish independence as one country, and other people who wanted to stay in Ireland. Around 3,000 people died in this trouble. And then in the 90s, John Major, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, he worked on a peace process, and Tony Blair then, his following Prime Minister, he then made it possible that in 1998 the Good Friday Agreement could be signed. Northern Ireland got the Northern Ireland Assembly and could govern it partly with that itself, and the paramilitary groups decommissioned their arms and are inactive. And that is according to the Life in UK Test Handbook on the pages 47 and 48 and others.
The Roman army. The Roman Empire around the Mediterranean Sea around 2000 years ago, they could raise an army of 800,000 people. And from 100 before Christ onwards, these were professionals who did it for a living, and when they were paid, they got 1/3 then in food. Now, when they were fighting, they sometimes used a formation called the testudo. they had their shields, the scutari, in front of them. And so the people in the front row having them in front of them, the people at the side of that block having them at the side, and the other people also, and the people in the middle holding it up. So it's a big, almost like a military, an armored vehicle, that whole thing, all standing very tight together. And when they were fighting. Now we had the long spears also. And in the Roman soldier, they had 2 spears to throw, and also a short sword, the gladius, 60 centimeters now. And they were also carrying a lot of other things. So first of all, they had to be very fit. 3 times a month, they were going on to walks, 4-hour walks, in which they were walking for 8 kilometers, so pretty fast, bearing weight. And so we made them 30 kilometers in that time with that backpack. Now, and also, when they were besieging another town, they had built sieging vehicles, catapults and other things. And they didn't only had to carry all these other things, they also were carrying shovels and pickaxes and food, clothing and other things, because they had to live and they were building forts and they had to have more things. Now, and there were legions. So these 800,000 people, they were split up into legions. One legion with 5,000 soldiers now. 800,000 were possible in a serious condition. So 5,000 people were fighting in a legion. Then a cohort had 500 people, and Centuri had 100 people. Centuri was led by a centurion, a cohort by a tribunus militium, and a legion by a legatus. That is according to Miles Kelly's World History book on the page 172 and 173. The Romans in Britain. In 55 before Christ, Julius Caesar tried to invade Britain, but he was unsuccessful. In 43 after Christ, Emperor Claudius tried the same, and he was successful. There was resistance, for example, by the leader of the Iceni, Boudicca, but the resistance wasn't successful. Boudicca has an honorable statue on the Westminster Bridge in London. The Roman state then, until 410, they then left to defend our areas of the country, but during the time they remained there in Britain, they built roads, public buildings, created a structure of law, and introduced new plants and animals. And they never conquered Scotland, so Emperor Hadrian, during the time when the Romans were there, built the Hadrian's Wall. And along the Hadrian's Wall there are, for example, 2 forts, Viondale and Housestead, and the whole Hadrian's Wall is a part of the UNESCO World Heritage. The search for Troy. Troy is the name of a city mentioned in the book Iliad, written by Homer 3,200 years ago, a Greek poet Homer. Now, and it was believed that this city Troy was entirely fictional. But then in 1822, there was Charles McClarence, and he suggested that this Troy was at the Mount Herzliya in Turkey, near the Dardanelles, which is a narrow sea linking the Black Sea to the Aegean Sea, which is part of the Mediterranean Sea. And then in 1871, there was Heinrich Schliemann, and he went to Turkey, where Herzliya, that place there, at the Dardanelles, and he was digging there. And in 1873, he found remains of an ancient city and remains of fortifications. And he found also a treasure, which he called then Priam's treasure, because he thought it was one of the king of Troy, and his name was in the book Priam. He's marked that treasure to Europe. Then in 1876 was Heinrich Schliemann digging in Mokain, which is in Greek, but it's close to Turkey. And there he found a tomb, and he thought that it was the tomb of Agamemnon, the king of a besieging army to Troy. But a gold mask found that it was actually 300 years older, so it was probably not Agamemnon's tomb. Then there was William Dorpfield, and in the 1890s, he suggested that this Troy found there at Herzliya, if it is Troy, is a city made out of 9 layers. So Herzliya, there were found 9 layers of city on top of each other. Troy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 8, 9. And now it is now believed that Troy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 were in Turkey at Mount Herzliya, near the Dardanelles, but narrow link between the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. Where at Herzliya, 9 layers of Troy. 1 to 5, Troy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are from the Bronze Age, which was 5,000 to 4,000 years old, are these 5 layers. And that the Troy mentioned in Homer's Iliad is Troy 7 or 7a. So the idea is that actually there at Herzliya, there in Turkey, at the Dardanelles, Troy 7a is the Troy mentioned in Homer's Iliad. And that is according to Miles Kell's World History on the page 126 and 127. In 1933, in Germany, Adolf Hitler came to power. And in the following years, from 1933 onwards, he built up the German military. In the year 1939, he invaded then, together with the Soviet Union, Poland. And he also annexed Czechoslovakia and Austria. Britain and France declared a war on Germany because of that. And the Second World War was going on now, in 1939. In 1940, the Germans had also conquered Belgium and the Netherlands. They were now advancing through France. And the British and French troops fighting in France to defend France against the Germans had to retreat. And they were now trapped at the west of France at the coast near Dunkirk. And 300,000 were trapped, and then the evacuation of Dunkirk happened. And from Britain out, not only the navy but also civilians with small pleasure boats and fishing boats sailed over to Dunkirk, from Britain to Dunkirk, and evacuated these 300,000 trapped soldiers. And that gave rise to the phrase, the Dunkirk spirit. Then, after France's fall, for 1 year Britain was fighting Germany almost alone. There were also Canada and Australia and New Zealand and the Union of South Africa and India fighting on behalf of the Allies. So these are the Allied at the time, and the other ones, Germany, Italy, and the Empire of Japan, the Axis. For 1 year, Britain was fighting alone, from June 1940 until June 1941. During that year, in the summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain happened. German airplanes were attacking Britain, and Britain, with the Royal Air Force, was defending itself with planes, for example, the Spitfire and the Hurricane. Britain won the Battle of Britain, but Germany continued to bomb the United Kingdom, in particular Coventry and the east end of London. And that bombing is known as the Blitz. And there's been the phrase, the Blitz spirit, and that means that the people are pulling together in hardship. So if someone says in the United Kingdom, the Blitz spirit, then they mean that the Britons are pulling together when they're facing hardship. During the time in Britain, the Prime Minister was Winston Churchill. In 1940, he became Prime Minister, and he was an inspirational leader for many Britons. In his first speech as a Prime Minister, he, for example, said one line, and that line was, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears and sweat." Then after the evacuation of the 300,000 trapped British and French soldiers from Dunkirk, he said, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." And during the Battle of Britain, so the air battle, there he said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much out by so many to so few." The Second World War was fought all over the world. Also in India, there was threat from Japan. So Japan was there also. And Britain was fighting in Singapore, and then also Burma was threatened, and India was threatened. Then Germany attacked the Soviet Union in the June 1941, and Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, so the United States, in December 1941. And now the Soviet Union and also the United States of America were also fighting against Germany, Italy, and Japan. Germany had heavy losses in the Soviet Union. When they attacked the Soviet Union, there were heavy losses for the Germans. And for both sides had heavy losses. But the Germany all over had heavy losses, and the Soviets were advancing. Now combined, all the Allied, for example, when all the time Britain, France, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the United States of America, the Soviet Union, got stronger, and on the 6th June 1944, they landed in the Normandy in western France and started to liberate France, other countries, and then also to push through Germany. And in May 1945, Germany surrendered from the combined forces from the Soviet Union and from the Allied forces landing in Normandy and conquering all of Europe. When we were at Manchester and Cambridge University, scientists working under the leadership of Ernest Rutherford on splitting the atom. And that was an important step in the Manhattan Project to make then the atom bomb. So in the Manhattan Project, the Americans then built the atom bomb, and they dropped two, one on Hiroshima and one on Nagasaki in Japan. And that forced Japan to surrender. So then Japan surrendered in the August 1945, and with that the Second World War ended. And that is according to the Life in UK Test Handbook on several pages, for example 50 and 51. The Siege of Londonderry was in the year 1689, and for 105 days was the Roman Catholic army of James II besieging the garrison Londonderry in Northern Ireland. After 105 days, a naval force relieved the besieged people, and they won basically that siege. And this besieging all contributed to the loss of now James II's Roman Catholic army, then later in the Battle of Blenheim. So they were weakened through besieging, which was not successful, over 105 days in 1689. And that is according to History of Mankind on the page 614 of the book Reader's Digest Library of Modern Knowledge, Part 2, Part 11. And that is written by T.F.C. Black, Harold Blackmore, Neil Grant, Robert Lacey, John O'Brien, Jonathan Sumption, Julie Winch, and Esmond Wright. In the year 1284 did King Edward I of England annex Wales with the Duke of Rutland. There followed 200 years of fighting, but in the middle of the 15th century the English could establish their rule. And huge castles were built to maintain this rule, for example, Conway and Carlton. And then the English laws and the English language were introduced in Wales. In Scotland the English were not so successful. There the Irish army, led by Robert the Bruce, won in the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 against the English. In Ireland the English sent troops to support the Irish king, and by around the year 1200, because some of the English troops had stayed and settled, controlled a region known as the Pale around Dublin. And the English ruling there was accepted by many important lords in Ireland. And that is according to the Life in UK Test Handbook, page 17. The Treaty of Amiens. It was signed on the 25th of March 1802, came into effect on the 27th March, and lasted until the 18th of May 1803, so for 14 months. And it was the only time of general peace in Europe in these 14 months, between 1793, around the time of the French Revolution, and 1814, the Battle of Waterloo. And it ended the wars of the Second Coalition, and one big thing was that Britain accepted France now as a republic after the French Revolution. And there were some people signing it. It was for Britain, was it the Marquis of Cornwallis? For France it was Joseph Bonaparte, brother of Napoleon Bonaparte. For the Batavian Republic, that is somewhere where Belgium, the Netherlands are, the Batavian Republic, Rutger Jan Schimmelpenninck, and for Spain, José Nicolás Ceasar. And why was it made? Now there were also humanitarian reasons. The Marquis of Cornwallis, for example, said that he didn't want to have continuous, helpless bloodshedding, for example. Or another thing was that the Prime Minister for domestic issues in Britain had changed in 1801 from William Pitt the Younger to Henry Edding. Now the people were starting to talking about how the treaty could be. And it wasn't going so well. The Batavian Republic is here written and quoted then that they were seen by the French. There was a lack of respect for them, that were seen as vanquished and conquered, and that they owned France everything. And also, Lord Cornwallis wrote that he said that he wrote, "I feel it as the most unpleasant circumstance attending this unpleasant business that, after I have obtained his acquaintance on any point, that I can have no confidence that it is finally settled, and that he will not recede from it in our next conversation about Joseph Bonaparte." Now it was talking there. Was it Lord Hawkesbury on the British side, with Louis Guillaume Otto on the French side, the French Commissioner of War in London? But Louis Guillaume Otto was under detailing the instructions of Napoleon, and so then Lord Hawkesbury opened the second line of communication with sending Anthony Merry to Paris to talk in the second line of communication with Talleyrand, Charles Marie Talleyrand. And when we're talking, and then there were some things happening, why they had to sign now under pressure. And Britain was talking about the budget in the parliament. It's not said explicitly here, but it must be about on what money to spend in the next year, on military, if wars continued or not. And there was a huge pressure on Lord Cornwallis to sign or to not sign, which Lord Cornwallis seemed to not want, because he wanted peace. And during the peace, these 40 months, Britain then kept its large peacetime army. They did not demobilize of 180,000, I think, was it, troops. And also they used that year to build up the navy. And then they had given Lord Hawkesbury an ultimatum to sign, and then they're talking about Malta. Malta was the big issue, who got Malta. It seemed to have been part of St. John's Holy Knights order, and then it became occupied by France, but then during the war Britain had got it, and it was in the hands of Britain. And then we were talking about that, and then Lord Hawkesbury got an ultimatum to sign, and after then, shortly after the ultimatum had run out, after a 5-hour-long meeting, Lord Hawkesbury signed. And he said he was worried and unhappy with the treaty, but he also was not happy that the war would go on and it would be just hopeless, useless bloodshed. About the signing of this preliminary agreement, which was done then, there was a great joy in Europe. There were poems written in the languages German, English, French, and on the stage people were acting it out, and fireworks were done in Britain. In Britain, the people hoped that the income tax, which had been imposed a few years earlier, would be gone away, that the market had a revival, and that the grain prices would go down. Some reasons for making the treaty were also on Britain's side, that they feared war with Russia, and that they wanted more trading with Europe. And now it was signed and the people waited for it, wanted it. And another reason was that the mood was a bit changing in Britain about some people who wanted peace. Now read about the things which were happening in Europe with Napoleon, and they read about it in newspapers in more strong moralizing colors. It's written like that here. And that made the people who wanted peace also turn away. Lord Hawkesbury also saw that is what he saw. And so he had a pressure to come to peace before the public opinion would change. It was happening that France was involving stronger in the Batavian Republic. France was supporting a French general with a revolutionary coup d'etat, and also, I don't know, something else, but that was. And they read about it and they saw that France was having influence, and that's also where the pressure to make that peace now. When the peace was, after some time it was then signed also the actual treatment. There was made 2 days later an addendum when saying that it was not, that it should not set a precedent, that it was written only in English and French and not in Dutch probably and in Spanish of the other signatory parties, that should not set a precedent for future contracts or treaties. And also then that some titles were said wrong, that is not part because of prejudice or something. Now some things were done about the Cape Colony in South Africa, who got it, about Malta, that it stays a bit longer British, but that Britain should retreat when other things with Trinidad should become a part of Britain. That was allowed to Spain. Spain's allegiance with France came a bit under pressure during the time. One reason was that Spain wanted that, or had hoped that France would block that Trinidad, an island in the Caribbean, would not become British, which France didn't block. And now Spain, for example, the economy in Spain is recovered during that time, for example. Now, and then there was this 14 months of peace, and traveling in Europe started again. Expatriates came back to France now under released restrictions who had fled during the French Revolution or something. And people also came, also some people named here the name. William Herschel, for example, went to the Observatoire in Paris probably to make astronomy or something. And Marie Tussaud got to London and opened the second exhibition as Marie Tussaud, so she had in Paris. Or André Jacques Garnier went also to London and flew with a hot air balloon from London to Colchester in 45 minutes. And there was in the Louvre in Paris the Exposition des Produits Français à l'Industrie or something. And Napoleon, the private secretary of Napoleon, said then that Napoleon was above all delighted about the numerous foreigners who expressed their delight about the exhibition. But it was not all perfectly. There were some problems. Malta was a big problem all the time. Now, but also other diplomatic problems. Britain felt insulted that France or Napoleon said that Britain had no voice in Europe. And also should Britain censor the entire British press. And also should they expel and expatriate people who had gotten there. Expel them. And Britain saw this as an affront against their sovereignty. And King George III, I think was also an elector of the Holy Roman Empire. This is where Germany is. And they felt insulted for that. Then more things. Napoleon had made the Treaty of Luneville a year earlier to the Treaty of Amiens. Britain had not signed it, but Napoleon had signed it, and that he had said that he would not accept the presidency of the Italian Republic in northern Italy, which he then did, and he became the president of northern Italy. And also sent troops into the Helvetic Republic in Switzerland and occupied it. And also a stronger influence than more on the Netherlands. And he dispatched naval ships or something, to regain revolutionary Haiti in the Caribbean. And also to take control again or still, of French Louisiana. Louisiana was then sold by Napoleon to the United States, to the Thomas Jefferson administration. Other things which Napoleon also did was to make the Napoleonic Code. With the Concordat, he made peace with the Vatican. That was one thing said, for example, in the treaty, that he should retreat from the Kingdom of Naples and from the Papal State and from Egypt also. That has been also a big issue when the treaty breaks down. So Napoleon made the Concordat to make peace with the Vatican, the Napoleonic Code, with that he did something, and also a new constitution. A new Napoleonic Code making a new legal system in France, and a new constitution with which he became emperor of lifetime. Now, and when these were the promises. So Britain saw themselves threatened, insulted, and also threatened on a global stage by France's imperialistic actions which they did, and also that they had nothing to say in Europe, and that France was not holding to the Treaty of Luneville, but they attacked Switzerland and accepted the presidency of Italy. And we saw that France was weak. Britain kept a large peacetime army and did not demobilize and built out its navy. And when the war started again, Britain was in the Battle of Trafalgar very quickly able to regain an upper hand on the oceans with the Battle of Trafalgar a bit later. And they saw that France was in a weakened position also. And now, then there became more diplomatic problems. So Britain saw that, what was happening in Europe with Napoleon, and then they seized on the Malta issue. It's written like that. They seized on the Malta issue. They had signed in the treaty that they would retreat from Malta within 3 months, and they didn't do it. And Napoleon pressed them on it. He published a report in which he stated how easily he could regain Egypt or take Egypt. That was something similar which he did. And then also later he said then to Lord Whitworth, which was the British-French ambassador, in an interview that Britain should retreat from Malta, and he threatened war. And Lord Whitworth felt like he had gotten an ultimatum that war would come if not Britain would go away. And so he said how easy he could get Egypt, and that he would have war if Britain would not retreat. Britain was seeing that he was having actions in Switzerland, in the Helvetic Republic, in the Batavian Republic, with the influence on Netherlands or whatever it is, Belgium. I don't know if just what it takes. And these things. And then it got more and more. Then Napoleon said then also in a public meeting again, where other people were there, pressured he again onto Malta. And that saw now the Russian ambassador Markov, and he reported then back to Russia, to the Tsar, that France was threatening, and also did he report then back to Russia that rumors that France had taken an eye on Hanover and on Hamburg in northern Western Germany. And following that, then the Russians assembled troops in the Baltic because of the threats of Napoleon then to Western Germany, because Russia saw it as now that would now be part of their business if Napoleon would be doing something then in Western Germany. It was not Germany at the time. And then Britain made an ultimatum to France, and saying that France would retreat from Switzerland and something else, and that Malta would be staying part of Britain for 10 more years. Napoleon said that he would accept the Ottoman Empire's, so that Turkey is, the Ottoman Empire's integrity. That had probably something to do with Egypt, that he would not attack Egypt again. The British troops were also, there was war related something. I don't know, just from this article. But he did not accept that on Malta. And when it got worse, they were talking again under big pressure that war was imminent. And then on the 17th of May, when Britain seized all the ships, all the French and Dutch ships in the ports and at the coast, on the 18th of May, when war was declared on France, naming as reason the hostile actions against the Empire, the West Indies, and Britain. And then on the 18th of May, war was declared again. France then also arrested all male British people. Some were taken as prisoner for over 10 years then, until all the wars, the Napoleonic Wars, had ended. And then the war got on again. This time Austria and Russia joined the coalition against France. And at that time also, shortly before the war started, France was again making signs that they would attack Britain again. Now here's the text that is written like that. Napoleon didn't feel ready to attack again, to make war again. So he showed signs that he was preparing again an invasion of Britain. It never happened that Napoleon invaded Britain, but he had made preparations early or something. And now he made signs that he would do it again. When the seizing all Dutch and French ships, I don't even know if that news made it to Napoleon. So and then one day later on the 18th, then declaration of war against France. France arresting all the people who were English. How big of an impact it was, it's not really here. And then in secret, the Grand Army of Napoleon was marched away from France, from Normandy, where they were assembling to pretend that they would attack England, to Ulm and defeating there the Austrian army. And then one day later is the Battle of Trafalgar, where Britain wins with the ships against Admiral Nelson against Spain and France. But then the next battle comes at Austerlitz, and where Napoleon wins then, but the wars go on for over 10 years. And then there is the Battle of Waterloo then in 1814, and where Napoleon is then defeated. And the Treaty of Amiens are these 14 months in between these 30 years of war in Europe. And that is according to the Wikipedia article of the Treaty of Amiens, but the views and positions mentioned here in the article don't necessarily align with my own or with the entities spoken of. The Trojan Wars. So during the time 1600 before Christ and 1100 before Christ, in Greek were the Mycenaeans, and they had smaller kingdoms, and all these smaller kingdoms had a hilltop called Acropolis, and in these societies there was then often the political world discussed at the fireside. And it was also at the time usual that the kings of the Mycenaeans were buried in beehive-shaped tombs with a corridor entrance, and they were called pholos. Now, there lived Homer. He was a poet, an author, and he wrote a story about the Trojan Wars. It was thought that that was maybe just an invention by Homer, just a story written, but over time it became more and more likely that actually the city Troy existed, and that at least some truth is in the stories told by Homer in his book about the Trojan Wars. Now, there is not told in this book that there was Helen, and she was married to Menelaus, the brother of the Mycenaean king Agamemnon. But she went then with the Trojan prince Paris to Troy. And now the Mycenaeans, with Menelaus and Agamemnon, they started to besiege Troy with Paris, Helen, there to get her back. There were important figures. There's, for example, Odysseus fighting on the Mycenaean side. He went then later back and lived through his Odysseus. And there were also then Achilles fighting on the Mycenaean side, on the besieging side. He had only the problem with his Achilles tendon, but he's a legendary warrior. And then inside of Troy, there was also Hector fighting, the brother of Paris, fighting from inside Troy. Now, the whole Trojan War ended then with the Trojan horse. Told in Homer's story. The Mycenaeans who besieged Troy left when on the beach a wooden horse, a big giant wooden horse, according to the story. And now the people of Troy thought it was a gift of the gods, and that they had left the Mycenaeans, and the gods had left them that gift there, that wooden horse, a giant wooden horse, pulled it into the city, celebrated, and thought now the war was over, and that wooden horse was a gift. But the story tells that actually there were warriors of the Mycenaeans hidden inside of a big wooden horse, and in the night they climbed out and opened the gate, and the Mycenaeans returned. It was just a trap, and they won the Trojan Wars. And during the time, it was a bronze time, so they had swords out of bronze, and also leg guards out of bronze, and breastplates out of bronze, and so on. And also at the helmets they had crescent, probably to make them look more impressive warriors. And that is according to Miles Kell's World History book, page 110 and 111. The Vikings were from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And in the year 789, they started to raid coastal towns in England and Scotland. They stole goods and they also took slaves. Over time then, some Vikings stayed, but they were then defeated by King Aethelred the Great, under whom the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms which were in England unified. But even after their being defeated by King Aethelred the Great, many stayed longer, and they settled, and they mixed with local communities, and some also converted to Christianity. And in Scotland there was also the threat of Viking attacks, and so the people of Scotland unified under Kenneth MacAlpin. And that is also the time when firstly the term Scotland was used for the region. And that is according to the Life and UK Test Handbook on the page 50. In the 1400s, there was an indecision about who to be the next king. And there was a rivalry between the House of Lancaster, they had the symbol the red rose, and the House of York, they had the symbol the white rose. The leader of the House of Lancaster was Henry Tudor, and the leader of the House of York was King Richard III. From 1455 for 30 years until 1485, there was a civil war. Then in the year 1485, there was the decision-making battle of Bosworth Field. In that battle, King Richard III died, and Henry Tudor became king and was then known as Henry VII, King Henry VII. King Henry VII then married Elizabeth of York. She was the niece of King Richard III, and that united the two families. And they had a new symbol, so out of the red rose out of the House of Lancaster and the white rose out of the House of York became the red and white rose of the House of Tudor, according to the Life in UK Test Handbook, page 21. Viking invasions to Britain. After the Romans had left Britain 400 after Christ, there the Vikings were coming, and they were mostly during that time peaceful. Then in the 7th century they became more aggressive. They raided towns and they killed people, they stole people, they kidnapped people, they robbed goods, and so on. In 873 they got the river Treat up and the 32 longboats, and then also pillaged a Saxon village. Then they started to settle a bit more. They established a bit of trading area at York and also founded by Dublin. And Aethelred the Great was able to make a Danelaw. He fought against them, and when the Danelaw was made, the Vikings stayed behind the line. And the Vikings, they had long skips. With them they were doing raids 20 meters long, narrow, so they could drive fast, and also the rivers up, and knots, these were cargo ships, so they could transport things. They made it also up to North America, Leif Erikson, proving through maps. And now after they settled there a little bit, then after some time there was no Aethelred the Unready on the throne, called like that, and he was advised to bribe them, also to give them money to pay them off. He collected taxes to pay them, but he was just strengthening them. And when one day in 1002 he ordered a massacre, but he tried then to establish laws, for example at an Ironside, but it didn't really work out. Aethelred the Unready got into exile in the Normandy, came later back, but then it became just out of Edmund Ironside and Canute, who became his successor. And they agreed then after some battles, and it became then, after Edmund Ironside died, Canute the next king, and he was then a Dane. And the most fierce warriors of Vikings were called berserkers, they had oftentimes attacked with surprise, and they were treasuring the weapons a lot. But not only that, when they stayed also, they were also making crafts things. So not only were they able to make these boats, for example, one person was buried in such a boat after the person had died, and the boat was in use for 100 years previously, seeing where it was maintained, if it is visible as the wood. They were also doing things, and they had also administrative skill. And that is according to the history of the kings and queens of England and Scotland, written by Edmund Swinglehurst on the page 16 and 17. Wernher von Braun. He was born 1912 in Germany, and already in his school days he was interested in rocketry. And then in the 1930s he worked for the German Society for Space Travel, and then from 1937 onwards he worked in Peenemünde for the German Army also, and there he helped to design and build rockets, for example the V2 weapon, which was then used by the Germans against England. And already during the war years in Peenemünde he planned multi-stage rockets, so rockets which have part, then use the fuel out of it, burn it down, and then split that part of the rocket off, and then continue with the other parts, and so on. Then when the war went to the end, then he came with most other scientists working there at this rockets station of the German army in Peenemünde to the United States of America and started to work there for ballistics and military. Then in 1960 he joined the NASA, and there he worked on building the Saturn series, so rockets which were then used in the NASA program to bring the Apollo missions to the moon of the US Americans. And there he built the Saturn V, of which the Apollo missions were brought to the moon. And that is according to the Reader's Digest Library of Modern Knowledge, Book 1, Part 1, Structure of the Universe, written by Ian Ridpath and John R. Shakespeare, on the page 51.
Where love is planted, there it grows, it buds and blows like any rose, out of In Yon Garden by Anonymous.
William the Conqueror. He was the King of England from 1066 until 1087. His father was Robert, the Duke of Normandy, and his eldest son has also the name Robert, and his third son has the name Rufus. His third son Rufus became then the King of England in 1087. And he was an illegitimate son to his father, but he inherited the throne and it was accepted, but there was already at that time some rivalry between who becomes now the Duke of Normandy. Then at some time there was Edward the Confessor, the King of England, in exile by William the Conqueror, just then William, in the Normandy, and as a return for the favor that he was protected there, he said that he would make one day William the Conqueror to be the King of England. Later on, he considered differently, and Edward the Confessor made Harold of East Wessex to become the new king. William of Normandy, he didn't like that, and he invaded England on the 28th September 1066. Harold of East Anglia was in the northern part of England. He was fighting a Viking horde, he went down, and then in the Battle of Hastings, Harold of East Wessex was defeated. He died even in the battle. And William the Conqueror went on, and then on the Christmas Day, 1066, he crowned himself in Westminster Abbey in London, the new King of England. There was rebellion against that by Edward of Mercia over here were the Awake of East Anglia, but he defeated them, and he became more and more the whole King of England. And he invaded also Scotland, and he fought against the troops of Malcolm III, and he obliged Malcolm III to accept him as an overlord. He let churches built and castles in strategic places to govern the country. And then one day he had an accident or something with his horse in Nantes, and he died after that fall. And then he was at some time also, there was a rebellion by his first son Robert, and he was defeating that also in a battle. Robert was the Duke of Normandy then or something. He defeated that, or in the Normandy was a rebellion. He defeated it. It's not success so perfectly in the book. And so he did not make Robert his successor, but Rufus, his third son. So after him, then his third son Rufus was governing England, and his first son the Normandy. That led also to some problems. There were some lords who had estates in both regions, and so they weren't so sure who was governing where. And then at one time when Robert was lending money from Rufus because he wanted to join the crusade and so on. So the story goes on. But something else happened at the time. William the Conqueror sent people out to record what was happening everywhere in the country. So who obtained what lord was having what property, what estate, what country, what land was what lord obtaining, what people were living there, how many people, what cities were in the countries, and what animals were living there, everything. And that book did he then use to demand contributions from the people, and so that he could make taxes based on that and control the whole country. And that book exists still. It can be seen in the public records in London. And it gives some insight into how the country looked at the time, with the geography and how the people lived and the legal system and so on. That is according to the history of the kings and queens of England and Scotland, written by Edmund Swinglehurst on the pages 28 and 29.
Winston Churchill, who was born in the year 1874, was a soldier and journalist. In the year 1900 he became a member of Parliament for the Conservative Party. Then, during the Second World War in the year 1940, he became the Prime Minister. So he led Britain basically through the Second World War. He was an inspirational leader through the British people during that phase of hardship. He made many speeches, and there are some quotes of him still in use today. For example, in one speech he said, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears and sweat." Or another one he said, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the streets and in the fields, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." Or he also said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." In 1945, his Conservative Party, wasn't re-elected. The Labour Party was elected. The people wanted change in social things. That was already done during his premiership in educational system reform, but the people wanted more, and so a Labour government was voted in, then under the leadership of Clemen Attlee, and then, for example, the NHS, the National Health Service, was established. But after the time of Clemen Attlee as a Prime Minister, Winston Churchill became again Prime Minister in 1951. And he is still today a much admired figure in the United Kingdom. And that is according to the Life in UK Test Handbook, page 50.